This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Tired of ads crashing your comedy podcast party? Good news. Ad-free listening on Amazon Music is included with your Prime membership. Just head to amazon.com/ad-free comedy to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads. Enjoy thousands of Acast shows ad-free for Prime subscribers. Some shows may have ads.
This podcast is brought to you by eHarmony. Finding someone who gets you is hard, right? You're not alone. That's because we're human. And there's a lot of different humans out there. Which is why eHarmony's personality-based dating app helps you find someone you can be your whole self with. Someone you can be fully comfortable with. That's what true connection and compatibility are all about. Being seen, heard, understood. When you match based on personality, you're already one step ahead when it comes to getting to know one another. So try eHarmony and get started today for free. eHarmony. Get who gets you.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Okay, so the guys are just pulling off a rope that is kind of covered in
seaweed.
I'm on a farm, but a very different kind of farm to one I would normally be visiting on the food programme. We're out on what feels like open water in St Austell Bay in Cornwall to see a pioneering food production method that some people claim could be the solution to many of the issues we face as a species.
See them here.
Wow, so by spring next year, these tiny, like miniature, minuscule versions of the full plant will have grown to the full thing.
Hopefully.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'm Leyla Kazim, welcome to the food programme. There are a lot of people in a lot of countries working towards a world where farming seaweed becomes a normal part of our food system in the same way that fish or agriculture are. These people, from farmers to policymakers to chefs to scientists, there aren't that many of them yet, but their numbers are growing and they are optimists. Maybe the chief optimist amongst them is this man.
I'm Vincent Doumézel. I'm Food Program Director at the Lloyd's Register Foundation in London. I'm also Senior Advisor for the United Nations Global Compact, and I'm also author of the book The Seaweed Revolution.
How did you get into seaweed?
Well, I used to work in the food industry, for many, many years. And all over my career, I tried to find solutions for this food industry to be more sustainable and more efficient. And in the end, I realized that there was no solution. The food industry is one of the main contributors, if not the main contributor, to global warming, to biodiversity loss, water scarcity, soil depletion, and social injustice. And in the meantime, it fails to feed 1 billion people on this planet. And then if you step back, 70% of our planet are ocean that contribute to less than 2% of our food. So if we want to build something regenerative, something really global, something really sustainable, I think we have to start with the ocean.
How do you think seaweed can save the world? And what would be your pitch to the people in the UK?
Well, seaweed is the greatest untapped resource we have. It's a nutritional bomb, so it's good for people, it's good for animals. It can replace fertilizers, it can replace plastic. It can restore biodiversity in the ocean, restore life. It can combat climate change as well, sequester carbon on one hand, decarbonize the economy on the other hand. And last but certainly not least, it can contribute to create jobs and revenues in coastal community where we all know that fishing resources will disappear.
Exhilarating.
Always nice, eh?
Yeah. So how does seaweed farming work? I took a bumpy ride on a boat out into St Austell Bay to find out.
What we do is we send some fertile material that we send that to a company to kind of let them release the spores, and then we grow those spores on the twine, and then we put the twine out on the ropes here in the water. So that's all done in October.
We're here with Tim van Berkel from the Cornish Seaweed Company. who are pioneers in cultivating seaweed in the UK. We're looking at a large area dotted with grey buoys spaced out on the water.
We just leave it and then put some barrels on them and check that the lines don't get entangled in storms or anything. And then come March, April, May, it's time to harvest. Then the seaweed is about 1.5 to 2 meters.
Okay, so the guys are just pulling up a rope. Wow. Right, so you've just literally pulled up a rope that is kind of covered in
seaweed.
Yes, it's seaweed.
Believe it or not.
But not the seaweed.
Not the seaweed you want. No. So
growing.
this big one, this big horizontal one that you can see, that's the header rope. So this is kind of the infrastructure on which we put the cultivation ropes. This is the cultivation rope, and then on it you can see the twine.
Yes, so
this
twine that is wrapped around this vertical hanging cultivation rope is what has the little seedlings. Is that the right word?
Yeah, seedlings.
And which look like nothing at the minute because they've just been put in.
Here
right?
you can see them here.
Wow,
right?
so by spring these tiny versions of the full plant will have grown to the full thing.
Hopefully.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah.
And also, I'm not sure what I was expecting when we were going to be visiting a seaweed farm, because I guess when I think of farms, they're kind of like enclosed but this is not. This is literally just out in the open water.
Yeah, it grows in its natural environment here, so you don't have to cut down any forest. There's no disturbance really to any of the wildlife or the existing ecosystem.
You foraged for seaweed at first,
yeah.
Correct? So then why did you decide to move from foraging to farming?
So we started a business in 2012 and we were just foraging seaweed from the wild. I realized fairly quickly that demand would outstrip supply from just foraged seaweed. So we needed to figure out a new way of growing or of getting more products. So in 2017 I set up the first English seaweed farm with some grant money and gave it a go really.
And it's working out great.
It was actually a steep learning curve. The first year that we did it, we made pretty much all the mistakes you could make. We deployed it at the wrong year, we deployed it at the wrong depth. But finally I think about 2 years ago, we cracked it and we now know how to grow it.
This will become something of a theme when it comes to cultivating seaweed. On the one hand, it's a simple system of putting out some ropes and then harvesting once the seaweed has grown. But things are more complicated than they seem. So why go to all this trouble? Vincent Damozel again.
Seaweed is where everything starts. The first complex living organism on the planet, that was seaweed. So everything has grown around seaweed. So it hosts a lot of biodiversity. It is used as an habitat for reproduction. It will clean the ocean as well. It will absorb all what we call waste, which are actually they will use that as a bioresource. Phosphate, nitrogen, they will absorb it all.
So I'm just thinking, if there are seaweed farms growing seaweed for some sort of consumption or use, and we're saying it improves biodiversity, but then if you're harvesting that seaweed, aren't you then sort of getting rid of that habitat you've just created?
Well, yes and no. First of all, if you consider that during the growth phase, seaweed will lose 50% of its biomass because of current and so forth. So they will lose a lot of biomass, and this biomass will partly feed the biodiversity around and partly end up in sediment and lock down carbon.
So what's the evidence that seaweed could be good for carbon sequestration?
There's a lot of debate around that as well. And in general, science is not very advanced in seaweed. So we have to be very cautious on anything we say around this because we lack experience. Basically, what we can say is that on one hand, seaweed help decarbonization, replacing plastic and replacing fertilizers. It can help to decarbonize the economy, but it will help to sequester carbon. Seaweeds, some of them can grow very fast. Some of them grows up to 40 centimeters a day to reach 60 meters high. So they are real forests. So they absorb a lot of carbon. So that's a trap for the carbon. And the good thing is that some of the seaweeds, they will end up in the deep ocean, or at least they will feed an ecosystem that will end up in the deep ocean. And when you're in the deep ocean, the carbon sequestration is for very long. Typically, deep oceans, they can sequester carbon for thousands, if not millions of years, because there's very little bacteria there. And once again, carbon is not the only thing. I mean, because I think the crisis that we are facing right now is not only a climate crisis, it's a biodiversity crisis, it's a pollution crisis. And seaweed holds the solution for each of them.
Sounds good. So what is the current state of seaweed farming in the UK?
I'm Elisa Capuzzo. I'm a senior ecosystem scientist. I work at CIFAS, which is the Centre for the Environment, Fishery and Aquaculture Science in Weymouth. So it is quite difficult to actually keep an exact tally of how many seaweed farms we have in the UK. And that's because each of the devolved administration tends to have their own register. So what we've been doing recently, we have been looking at the 4 different registers and trying to estimate how many licenses there are. And we come up with 27. These are roughly distributed between England and Scotland, so 12 and 12. Then there is 1 in Northern Ireland and 2 in Wales. So just for comparison, back in 2016, there was actually only 1 commercial seaweed farm in the UK. So we certainly saw an increasing number.
So if there are all these benefits to seaweed farming, why aren't we seeing hundreds of them along our coasts?
The barriers are not just limited to a particular phase of the seaweed farm. We actually found barriers throughout the value chain, through the farming, the processing, and then the market. So at the farming stage, information, for example, on suitable location for farming, it's one of the key questions. But also potentially difficulties in obtaining a license. We then also look, for example, at the processing stage. So you need to process the seaweed. For example, you need to dry it and prepare it. And that can also be quite expensive to process the seaweed. But there are also many unknowns about the market demand and the consumer preference. So what people actually want to eat, how do they want to eat seaweed? We don't really have that information for the UK. And again, I think that can be a barrier potentially for a prospective farmer.
Getting the right license to farm seaweed can be tricky. It's relatively new, so regulation is still catching up, and it can take around 2 years before a seaweed farmer can put out their ropes.
We have a hilly patchwork of regulation. It's very complex to get a license to operate in the ocean for stupid reasons, but mostly ignorance. But so far, it's way more complicated to farm regenerative seaweed than to pump oil from the ocean, unfortunately.
The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, who oversees licences, told us in a statement.
We recognise the potential of the seaweed industry. In order to get a licence, seaweed farmers must comply with certain legislation. We are working with regulators to develop clearer guidance to help ease this process.
Perhaps the most obvious issue is the market in the UK. Seaweed grown here is still a fairly niche ingredient. There have been attempts to get it into supermarkets, but it hasn't found much success in the kitchens of UK consumers.
Firstly, Exhibit A, this pendant is a seaweed pulp pendant.
Oh my God. We're in Hackney because I want to talk to a chef who has made it his mission to change the way the public relates to the consumption of food.
My name is Douglas McMaster. I'm the father of Silo, which is the world's first zero-waste restaurant. Silo is a restaurant that doesn't have a bin, which means that we work directly with nature and we get everything we need package free, and then whatever remains is composted, and it's this circular design that doesn't damage the planet.
Douglas has been involved in the zero waste movement for over 10 years. It's an idea most of us are probably quite familiar with now, and using seaweed in his cooking has been part of this for some time.
So what's made you decide to include seaweed on your menu?
It's just a no-brainer in terms of the environment. You know, we're an island, we're surrounded by an abundance of various different seaweeds, all with different delicious flavour applications, particularly good if you like umami flavours and working in that spectrum, and we do. And it's just such a variety of untapped resources that we just love using creatively.
Okay, so on this table we've got 5 plates, each with some with dried seaweed on, and we've got some fresh seaweed here. Could you talk us through these different seaweeds, because they do all look very different, and what you do with them?
The seaweed that we're looking at now is from Carrymore, which is an amazing environmentally forward seaweed farm in Pembrokeshire in Wales. We're using it currently in a plethora of different ways, but mostly as kind of like seasonings.
This is kelp, which is, we've got a sheet of it here, and it's a kind of dark brown, muddy green, almost cardboard-like. And what do you do with this?
So the beauty of this is that because it's like a big sheet, in terms of like the way you shape it, it's so easy, it's so practical, like, oh, we're going to make a cannelloni.
Or lasagna.
Lasagna, you could do all these kind of crazy things because they've just got these very workable sheets. But traditionally, dashi is the thing to do with kelp.
Dashi being?
Seaweed stock.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the sea lettuce. Here it is dried. What would you do with this?
Sea lettuce and dulse are probably the most popular seaweed choices that we, over the sort of decade of silo have used. And but yeah, we pickle a lot of sea lettuce and red dulse. It's just an amazing pickle.
And I love how dried it and if you can hear it. It looks like green tissue paper. Do you think chefs are a bit hesitant embracing seaweed because it is such a big part of other cultures?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stigma around fusion, which I think is a little bit sort of, it's a bit silly, really. Yeah, we're an island surrounded by seaweed. Like, why are we not using seaweed? It makes no sense. What exacerbates the silliness is that we'll import seaweed from Japan to make dashi.
So then, if someone was dining here, how would seaweed appear on their plate? Is it like the star of the dish, or is it kind of in a little ferment on the side? How do you use it here?
We've got an innovations to-do list, and seaweed is right at the top, because the question you've just asked is it front line and centre? It should be. It's not yet, and that is the truth about our journey to bring seaweed into a greater sort of central location in people's consciousness. It should be in the centre of somebody's dish, and somebody should sit down and be like, ooh, seaweed. Whether that's, I don't know, a kelp salad or, a sargassum sorbet, whatever. I just made those both up.
They sound great.
They do, actually, yeah.
Put it on the next menu.
Put that on the innovations to-do list.
In this country, we probably, and as part of our food culture, don't necessarily appreciate sea vegetables, seaweed as a food as much as in other cultures. Why should people want to eat more of it?
It's interesting. You mentioned the sea vegetables, and I think that's part of it. There's a problem with the name. But to answer your question, I think that there's something about history here, where we removed seaweed from history back when we started agriculture 12,000 years ago in Europe, notably in Mesopotamia, around the Mediterranean region. The Mediterranean region is a very bad area for seaweed production, actually. We focused a lot of our effort on land production at this time. It was very efficient. We built the first cities and so forth. The beginning of agriculture, the development of this land-based agriculture, removed seaweed from the history. And we see that everywhere this Greek and Roman civilization is going, they are removing seaweed from history. The Viking used to have a lot of seaweed, eat a lot of seaweed. They onboarded seaweed on their ships, which is why they were traveling so far, because seaweed is full of vitamin C. So these did not suffer from scurvy. And the only place where we still eat seaweed massively in this world is Japan, which is also the only place that has not been colonialized by Europeans in the 19th century.
Although, as we've said, seaweed farming is just putting out some ropes, there is serious investment that needs to happen to get it going. Equipment, especially boats, can be very expensive. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. The low visibility of UK-grown seaweed means there isn't much of a market for it. And because the market is so small, businesses are hesitant to invest. Introducing another optimist, a man who could end up growing a lot of seaweed.
Yeah, I've spent most of my life roundabout messing around on boats.
Ollie Hicks has braved storms and 126 days at sea to become the first Briton and the youngest person to row solo from New York to Europe.
And that was the beginning of, I don't know if we can call it a career, but a series of misguided adventures trying to cross large bodies of water in sort of ever smaller boats. Hi, my name's Ollie Hicks and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Algapelago. We are primarily growing seaweed, a type of seaweed called sugar kelp. We grow it on ropes about 4 miles out to sea. We're the most offshore aquaculture farm in Europe. And we're also looking to expand that into what they call sort of integrated mariculture. So the cultivation of different species on the same site. So you might grow mussels and scallops alongside the kelp.
How does one go from those crazy adventurous feats to starting an aquaculture business in Devon?
Well, I think if you put it in context, it makes quite a lot of sense. Why would anyone want to spend 124 days alone on a small boat? So if that's your mindset, then maybe you would be daft enough to set up a company to grow seaweed for which there's very little interest or industry or market, certainly in the United Kingdom as of today.
Ollie's kelp won't be turned into dried flakes or going into salads. It's entering the food system much earlier on in the process.
At the moment, we turn all our kelp into agricultural products because that's where we see that there's a viable, ready market. You know, we're growing only small amounts of this kelp at the moment, but once the farm is scaled up to its full size, it'll be putting out about 3,000 tons of kelp a year. Now, everyone thinks of seaweed in terms of sushi, but, you know, I should think the entire amount of sushi consumed in the UK is well under 3,000 tons. So that market is just not really there for industrially grown sort of levels of seaweed. Whereas actually you could use 3,000 tons of seaweed in an agricultural setting quite easily if you think of it being spread on fields or spread on allotments, for example.
Do you think there is a future of British seaweed being used extensively in food?
I think certainly that British seaweed farming will proliferate, and food is undoubtedly going to be part of that product use. Just for my money, I think the big users of food will be what I'd call big food cos. So it's going to be the Unilevers, the Nestlés, taking that, or the Heinz's. You know, we did talk to Heinz, and an example use case was that if they were to replace their salt in their ketchup with seaweed, which would be feasible, they'd need 3 million tons every year of fresh seaweed. So that'd be 10% of the global seaweed supply. So going back to the chicken and egg situation, is farmers can't produce that much yet in Europe, and big food can't rely on it as a secure supply stream. So it's in this sort of limbo land of what's going to unlock the industry first.
As we've touched on, investment is a massive issue when it comes to starting seaweed farms. We're out at sea again with Tim and the Cornish Seaweed Company.
When you first started out, what were the main barriers you encountered trying to set up the farm?
The biggest issues the biggest issue was to convince Gary to help us out and allow us to have some lines out in the water.
Gary is the one driving the boat because this is his mussel farm. The Cornish Seaweed Company sharing the farm with him is part of what makes their farm more viable. Working with already existing coastal businesses could be key to making seaweed farming commercial.
So my name's Gary Rule, I own West Country Mussels, and we're in the middle of St Austell Bay. When we first came out here 15 years ago, there was no other mussel farms offshore, but the mussels grew so well, we grew quite quickly, and now we have everything that a seaweed farmer would need.
That equipment is very expensive, and so to set up from scratch as a seaweed farmer, you know, it costs so much money, and you don't even know if your seaweed's going to grow well.
Right, so the boys I'm seeing might have mussels and might have seaweed. What is the benefit of, is there a benefit of having these two types of farms next to each other?
Yeah, there should be a benefit because the mussels, they release nutrients that the seaweed can eat, and the seaweed kind of cleans the area so that the mussels can grow better.
Gary, could you explain to me how
how Tim first approached you with this idea.
I have several mussel farms along the Cornish coast, and Tim lives particularly close to one of them. And he promised he'd keep an eye on my mussels for me if I let him put some seaweed lines out there. And I thought he was mad to start off. And certainly how we started off, it was too slow. But I think we're more of a commercial basis now. And I think that we've got a system where you could turn it into a serious commercial operation.
Time for the science bit. Or not. Vincent Dumézel again.
What would you say are the main barriers to creating more seaweed farms? Because there are a few of them in the UK. There aren't that many.
Yeah, the biggest one to me is the lack of science. I mean, we don't know very well how to cultivate our own seaweed. We know how to cultivate the Asian one because they have started this revolution not that long ago, 60, 70 years ago, starting to cultivate the ocean. So they learn how to domesticate their own seaweed, but we are yet to learn it. Digressing a bit on this, it's such a shame because the worldwide legend about seaweed domestication comes from UK, Kathleen Drew Baker.
Kathleen Drew Baker was a researcher who in the late 1940s published a paper on the life cycle of larva, as in lava bread. Lava is a similar species of seaweed to nori, which is used to make the seaweed sheets that wrap around sushi in Japan. Her research solved a problem in nori reproduction that had stumped the Japanese seaweed scientists and farmers for years. And what she discovered ended up unlocking a huge industry there. She died relatively young at the age of 55 and never even visited Japan. But she is honoured there on the 14th of April every year and was even bestowed with the name Mother of the Sea.
I mean, out of 12,000 seaweed worldwide, we know how to cultivate 20 of them maybe, and we can commercialize as food 10 of them. So there's a long way to go. The book is called The Seaweed Revolution because my take is that we moved from prehistory to modern history back 12,000 years ago when we stopped being hunters-gatherers on land and became farmers on land. But that only happened on land, and we are still hunters-gatherers in the Stone Age when it comes to the ocean.
Seaweed in Japan was already a massive part of food culture there, so cultivation was developed to help meet that demand. In the UK, we're building pretty much everything from scratch, the market and the farming. There's a lot of work to do, but also opportunities to do it differently.
I mean, growing seaweed in the sea and farming it in the sea, it sounds great, but we've made a lot of mistakes on land-based agriculture. How would we scale up seaweed farming in the sea without making those same mistakes?
We have to learn from what has happened. And I'm happy because I have this question each time I give a seaweed presentation, and I do a lot of them, especially from young people. So it means that there's something that's there, that people have understood what went wrong, and that something is going very wrong with our current food systems. And seaweed is a green field. There's nothing there. Everything is to be built. So let's build it from scratch in the right way. So everything is still to be built, and it's up to all of us to build it the way we want.
Tired of ads barging into your favorite news podcasts? Good news. Ad-free listening on Amazon Music is included with your Prime membership. Just head to amazon.com/ad-free news podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads. Enjoy thousands of Acast shows ad-free for Prime subscribers. Some shows may have ads.
So, how do we get AI right?
Well, we need the right volume of data and massive compute power. But with HPE GreenLake, we get access to supercomputing to power AI at the scale we need.
Search HPE GreenLake.